Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm well, thank you, and I hope you are too.
Thank you.
The the world is becoming increasingly complex, and I think it's a problem that we have not been noticing. That is, in general. I'm not talking about just you and me, and it really needs some attention. The thing is that with the a tremendous increase in population over the last 150 years, from just 1 billion in the first half of the 19th century to nearly 8 billion now, and the tremendous technological advances in communication, so that we can now, each of us communicate with pretty much anybody else anywhere in the world. Everything that has to do with organization, whether formal organization which is planned and legislated, or informal organization which is just the way people come together for different purposes, is always out of date. That is, it's never working it never seems to work anymore the way it was planned to work or hoped to work, or the way it came together in order to allow people to do what they wanted to do.
Mhm.
And this complexity, increases in complexity, is going to continue for at least the rest of this century, as population continues to grow, even though demographers tell us that we're probably going to reach a new plateau of increasing population, and so that we will finally become a global community, and won't keep becoming more, that is, the problems of organization, whether informal or formal, will not continue to become more difficult. But the two things that have two examples of these problems of increasing complexity, which I've had on my mind recently, are very different examples, but they together illustrate, I think, very well what this increasing complexity is, the problems this increasing complexity is creating for us. And these are things that we've talked about to some extent before, but I think this helps us to understand them better.
Okay.
And the first one I will say is that for some of us, it's difficult to understand why so many people have voted for Trump and as president of the US, and plan to vote for him again and support him unconditionally. And in particular, an example of these people that are now referred to as his base are white evangelicals. Mm-hmm. Now, our president, as far as I know, doesn't go to church, pays less respect to religion than most presidents have done in the past, even though they haven't been churchgoers. So why would evangelicals, who are the extreme of the religious minorities in the country at the moment, why would they support him? And I've been asking this question to various people, and they say it's because he doesn't despise them. They feel that they're despised by intellectuals generally, and now they have a president who doesn't who accepts them as anybody else, and doesn't look down on them because their attitudes towards religion are considered to be out of date. Now, I'm not sure whether this is correct, but it's at least a feasible explanation, and better than any other explanation I've come up with. And so this would illustrate the fact that as our society has become larger and our ways of interacting with each other, the interaction that is necessary for everyday life, have become more complex, people are breaking up more and more into small groups. And then those groups have to find a place in the larger society. And these small groupings are, to some extent, changing all the time, but their relationships with each other are often problematic. So that's my first example. My second example has to do with the organization of the world in terms of nation states. That ever since the end of the Second World War, which is now over half a century ago, it's since that time that we've been gradually becoming more and more aware of globalization and the need to have some sort of global awareness of relationships between nation states. The way nation states are evaluated informally in various ways. And because of the contribution that America made after the Second World War in bringing things together again, and especially US aid to various countries, it has a very special position in global interaction, especially in relation to Europe, Russia, and China, but to some extent also in relation to a number of other countries. And one could actually take the membership of the United Nations of, what is it, 193 states now?
I believe
and,
so. I believe so. I think it is 193.
List them in order of the way they're informally prioritized. And then there are problem nation states, which are defined as problems by the states at the top of the list, rather than the states at the bottom of the list. And the main example at the moment, of course, is Iran, which, because of the we keep being told that there's a increasing risk of war breaking out between the United States and Iran. But nobody says anything about the fact that Iran had a democratically elected government in the 1950s, which the Americans, with some help from the British, actually overthrew. And nobody says anything about the fact that America shot down by mistake, I think, an Iranian plane in 1988 in the Gulf. They only talk about things that Iran is seen as doing by the United States, with no effort at all to understand why Iran is doing these things. So I think these are two good examples of different levels of problems of organization that are have some formal context, but are also that have come about the way they are informally, which nobody quite knows what to do with in the modern world.
Well, I think
and we're going to see in the 2020 election a lot of discussion of these things.
Your first example in the response that people have given you about Trump simply not despising white evangelicals as being the key to obtaining their support is very interesting. I don't know if despising is the verb I would take. If I look at, for example, Obama's attitude towards them, or either the Bushes or Clintons, I think it was it's almost a sense of not making fun of them. All right, because the coastal elites, I think, do tend to do that. And Trump certainly does not do that, quite the opposite. I'm not sure yet as to, are you making a connection between Trump's attitude towards evangelicals and what's going on with Iran, or are these two separate
Only to
examples?
the extent that they both have to do with the increasing complexity of the modern world and the informal ways of interacting that have developed without enough awareness of the causes behind them.
Can I go all the way back to the first couple of minutes when you spoke about how, with the velocity of change that's occurring currently, how modes of interaction, no matter how recent they may be, are almost automatically immediately outdated? Can you talk a bit more about that? I'm a little unclear on that.
Because, well, now where should I start? The way people come together informally and form groups informally is changing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But the way things are organized formally are much more difficult to change
Mm-hmm.
because there's very explicit rules about how things should be changed, and it's almost impossible to do it quickly. The American Constitution is one example, of course. The idea of the nation state, which is less easy to put into a box of definitions like that, nevertheless is something that grew up all over the world in a slow but very, but in a way that was taken for granted, starting 300 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
And we have no way to replace it.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed to work very well in the period of what was still a period of empires up into the first half of the 20th century, and all the colonial districts of the empires, as the empires eventually fell apart, the colonial districts became nation states.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was what was taken for granted. However, they don't work as nation states, mm-hmm. and for a while they seem to be working, but now it's becoming more and more obvious that they're not working, and that something else is needed. And of course, Africa is the biggest, is the obvious example of this, but there are plenty of other examples in other parts of the world.
So for example, what you were talking about, the change that occurs almost immediately, just in the modes of communication, the modes of interaction socially at that lower level, people to people. Are those what are those outdate the institutional modes simply because of?
Well, they what's the word I'm looking for? They create situations so that the institutional mode doesn't work. So, and this is particularly the case in Africa, because in Africa the population was growing relatively slowly until about 50 years ago, mm-hmm. when the rate of growth began. That is up until the time that every part of Africa became independent again, and since then it's been growing much faster, and it's the rate of population growth in Africa over the last 50 years, which has increased the acceleration of increasing complexity, which is making the nation state solution to the end of the colonial period much more problematic.
You know, I'm struck by, again, going back to the white evangelicals, that it points out, I think, a great deal about what's happening in this world because of the factionalization and the breaking apart of these various interest groups. Simply to have an interest group, the white evangelicals, simply to have them not be made fun of by a president, albeit who has been married 3 times, who has been heard on a videotape talking about marital indiscretions in a most coarse and vulgar way. somebody who is really from an alternate universe of these people, to be embraced as a champion of them simply because of the fact that he doesn't make fun of them. And yet it rings very true. It does. It makes sense on a gut level kind of thing. I'm going to have to ponder this, but to realize that that's the point that we've evolved to. And it's not maybe not a bad way to be, because what we're talking about essentially at its root level is tolerance. It's tolerance. It's having tolerance toward other groups and their beliefs and their convictions, and not making fun of them. I mean, that's a good thing, even though for this reason, with this instance, it's being used for political purposes, I'm quite sure. But to have that as an overall goal, I think is laudable.
Well, tolerance is, after all, the acceptance of diversity. But with this increasing complexity all the time, diversity is becoming very different from what it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And religion, probably the majority of the population thinks of religion as something that is beginning to be old-fashioned, and is fewer and fewer people are interested in it. But what they don't understand is that it's religion as we used to think of it that's maybe old-fashioned because of the way society has changed. But religion as an extension of culture, as the way we think of ourselves situated in a larger universe, is still there.
Still quite alive, yes.
And depending on how you fit into the larger global population, global society, you're going to think of religion in very different ways. So there's always going to be religious minorities like the Islamic Ahmadiyya or the white evangelicals, as well as people who think of religion simply as Catholicism or Islam, who think it's not interesting anymore.
Well, that was very interesting. And I think we probably come to the end of our time. But thank you very much, Professor Spooner. We'll look forward to discussing another topic next week. Thank you.
See you then.
All right.